Well, welcome. I'm so glad that all of you come on a Sunday morning. It's always fun for Robin and I to do ministry for all of you. Each and every Sunday, I count it a privilege to stand in front of you. And every Sunday, I stand up here thinking, what am I doing? I am so nervous when I stand up here. So I just have to get the nervousness now. How many of you would be nervous if you were standing where I am? Raise your hand. I feel a lot better now. That's good. If you just joined us, maybe you're watching at home, maybe you're watching online. We're so glad that you're watching. You joined with us. We started a whole new series last week entitled Reset. That's kind of where we started with Reset last week. That all of us at some point in our lives can get to a place where we wish that we could just hit the reset button. It's as if all the past mistakes that we had ever made were just suddenly, instantly erased. Wouldn't it be great if we could just hit the reset button? Kind of like when you're playing the video games like you used to a long time ago on the TV, and you could just hit reset button, 0-0, new game. It's just all over. And we all get to these places in our life where we have made some mistakes, we've made some errors, we've gotten ourselves into some situations that we didn't want to get into, and it would be great if we could hit a reset button. And the incredible thing is this: we serve a God who's all about resetting. We serve a God who's all about redemption, which means He's willing to just pull us out of the pits. He's willing to pull us out of the places we get ourselves into and start fresh. We serve a God of second chances, second opportunities, second moments in life. He's got a reset button that just outdoes all other reset buttons. That's the kind of God that we serve. And I just want you to know that this morning. And that's where we're going, okay? So we serve a God that resets. Now, what we learned last week is that one of the reasons that we have a hard time resetting in our life is because we're not willing to own up to our past. We're not willing to admit our past mistakes, because if we were really, really honest with ourselves, the things that have happened to us in our past, not everything. I mean, there are things there's people here that honestly have been victimized through abuse and through neglect, and as children, or whatever the case is. All of that aside, but let's just be honest, there's other things we've made mistakes in life, in marriage or relationships or vocation or career or profession or money, and we've gotten ourselves into a real fix sometimes. And what we learned last week is that most of the time, no, all the time, it's really never our fault, is it? I mean, it was the boss, it was the teacher, it was the guy that we were married to, it was the girl that we were dating. It was their fault that everything kind of fell apart, if we were really, really honest, right? And the reason we learned that we are so good at blaming others, is because we're related to the first two people that we read about in the Bible, Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, man, they wrote the book literally on how to blame others for our problems, right? And so even the problems that we have today aren't our problems. It's because of Adam and Eve. So we don't have any responsibility, right? So we got, all right, this is good. We got kids awake over here in the sanctuary. That's awesome. And we like to blame others. In fact, we start to tell our story with enough truth in it. It's not the whole truth, but there's enough truth in our story that we begin to believe it's 100% true. And one of the reasons it's so hard to admit our mistakes, our failures, our shortcomings, is because it just takes the tension out of the story. And so, I mean, it's not a good story to say, yeah, I was a bad husband, or yeah, I could have been a better wife, or yeah, I knew that I shouldn't have gotten involved in that business deal, but I did, or yeah, I know that, the teacher might not have been the greatest teacher, but I'll take responsibility. I was a slough off in the class. I take responsibility. That's not a fun story to tell. And so we kind of hang on to the stories a little bit. We want to tell our side of the story. We want to lay the blame on other people. And what we found out last week is that you can never blame your way into a better future. You can blame others. You can say, well, you're the victim of abuse, or you're the victim of alcoholism, or you're an alcoholic, or whatever. You can blame all the stuff you want to. It doesn't make your future better. And what we learned last week from Scripture is that until we really own our piece of the past, we'll never have peace from our past. And so the first thing that we talked about as far as resetting in our life, the first thing that we need to do is just admit, hey, I've got some responsibility. I will take responsibility. I am partially, probably mostly to blame for why I am where I am today. And that's not always the case, but usually the case. So we have a hard time admitting. So we talked about resetting, and part of the resetting thing was just admitting your part of the story. Today we're going to go a little different direction. Another thing that we need to do to reset our lives sometimes, we need to think differently. not only just admit our mistakes and own up to our mistakes, sometimes we just have to think different. Another reason that we just have a hard time resetting ourselves, and the past repeats. In fact, it seems like it's just a repeat performance over and over again. And part of the reason is because we need to think differently. Part of the reason that you're having the same financial problems today as you've always had is because you think the same about money as you always have. Part of the reason that you're on the second or the third marriage and having the same struggles in this marriage as you had in the previous ones is because you're thinking the same about those marriages as you are right now. Part of the reason that you're in the situation, you're in this abusive relationship. You're in the abusive relationship, and it seems like this relationship is just like the last one. In fact, this relationship is just like all the other ones you've been in, and it causes you to say, well, all men are alike, or all women are alike. And you got to say, if all women are alike and all men are alike in these dating situations, what do all those other relationships have in common? You. All right, hate to say it that way, but that's kind of the way it comes across. And part of the reason you're having struggles in this relationship is because you think about yourself the way you've thought about yourself in the other relationships. That because I don't feel worthy of the best, I'll settle for second best. Because I think of myself as being second best, I'll settle for second best. Part of the reason you're in the financial situation you're in right now is because you think that money is there to buy things to comfort you and you feel alone. And so your credit cards are maxed out to the hilt. You can't afford to pay the bills, and you're just in this financial crisis all the time because you're thinking about stuff it's there to console you. Part of the reason that the diets have failed for you is because you think about food the way you've always thought about food. The reason the relationships fail is because you think about relationships the same all the time. And what I want you to understand this morning is that every destination in your life begins with a thought. Now, if you came to church this morning waiting to hear some profound teaching and some really deep insight from the Word of God, you came on the wrong Sunday, because we're just going to look at a couple of passages in a few moments that just really are so basic. This is black and white. This is 1, 2, 3 kind of Christianity. It's just common sense. You could figure this out on your own. It's just that sometimes it helps to have somebody to remind us of what we already know. But every destination that we get to begins with a thought. I remember back in 1969, on this day, July 20th, 1969, standing in my parents' living room, watching what I didn't fully understand on a 19-inch black and white television set, as astronauts stepped off of a spacecraft and onto the moon. That lunar landing began with a thought. It started there. The phone that's in your pocket, somebody had a concept, they had an idea. Wouldn't it be great if we could carry a phone in our pocket? I just want you to know that thought originated with me. Somebody else just capitalized on it, right? Okay, every destination begins with a thought. When somebody loses weight, it began with a thought. When somebody got married, it began with a thought. When somebody gets into an abusive relationship, it began with a thought. Every destination begins with a thought, whether it's good or bad. And so what we need to do sometimes is reset our lives by resetting our thinking. You cannot reset your life until you reset your thinking, to think different. And this is hard. This is so difficult because understand, we're going to talk about controlling our mind. And there's a lot of things that we can control. We can control our car. We're going to get out inside. We're going to control our car. You're going to hold on to the steering wheel, and you're going to control 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pounds of equipment going down the road. You can control a horse. You can get on the back of that horse, make that horse do all kinds of stuff. You can control a dog, but you can't control a cat. Somebody said, that's true. And as much as it's difficult to control a cat, it's hard to control your mind. Because how many of you are like me, when you try to concentrate, think about something, maybe even it's about prayer, sometimes it's like your brain is a banana tree and everything is monkeys, right? And it's just so hard to focus. And it's hard to take thoughts into captivity. It's hard to talk about what to do with thoughts because I can put my hand on the steering wheel, I can grab the reins of a horse, I can grab the leash of a dog's collar, but I can't put my hand on my brain and make it do stuff. So I have to be in control of my thoughts. And that, let's just be honest, can be very, very difficult. Because sometimes even if our thoughts go in a negative way, we like it. We just invite it. We just let our thoughts go there. We just follow right along and let them do what they want to do. Look, these struggles are nothing new. And the Apostle Paul writes a letter to a Christian church in Rome full of people that deal with and struggle with the same stuff that you and I do today. And Paul is writing a letter. We call it the book of Romans. We're going to go to Romans chapter 12 in just a moment. Romans chapter 12, if you want to follow along, we're going to get there in just a minute. But he's writing a letter, and he writes a letter to people just like you and just like me. And in this letter, he's writing to both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians just about the basics of life and our relationship with God and the unconditional love of God and how he's reached out to us. And in the midst of this thought, Paul writes some very practical things that we pick up on in Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse number 1. Let me read it for you, and then we'll talk about it as we go. Romans chapter 12, verse number 1, brothers and sisters. He says this, brothers and sisters. He's talking to Christians here. So if you're not a follower of Christ, you're just checking this out, you're kind of on the outside, you don't have to listen. You can get on your phone and surf the web right now. I'll give you permission, all right? And I'll just talk to the church a little bit, but I think there are some principles here that all of us can relate to. He says, I plead with you to give your bodies to God. Pause right there. I'll tell you what he means by this. It was very common in the culture that Paul is writing to that the body and the spirit were separate one from another. So you could be a follower of Christ and just worship God from your spirit, but your body could go do what your body ever wanted to do. It could sleep with a prostitute, it could be a gluttonous, it could go get drunk, it could do whatever it wanted to do, but since the body and the soul were separate, you weren't sinning because the body and the soul were separate. And here Paul pauses and says, no, look. The body is the vehicle to carry your spirit. And I want you to think about everything. I'm just going to pause right here. I want you to just think about everything that God has done for you. Pause. Just think about everything that God has done for you. I plead with you, in view of God's mercy, your Bible might say, to bring your bodies to God. Bring your whole self. Just lay it out there, and he'll tell you why in just a moment. He'll tell you why in just a moment. I just want you to just be vulnerable with God in light of everything that he has done for you. In this church, there is a cross on this wall right back here. The cross is the Christian symbol that reminds us of what Jesus did for us. Even on your worst day, Jesus still would have gone to the cross and taken the penalty that was owed to you. All of us get a sense inside of us that there's something wrong, we've done wrong, and there's going to be a punishment to follow. And Jesus says, that's why I want a relationship with you. Will you just receive me? Just receive me. I'll receive you. Just receive me. I took your penalty right there. Now I want to begin a relationship with you. And Paul says, look, in light of that, bring your whole self to God. Now he's going to go on in this thought. He says, let them, he goes on in that verse, let them, your bodies, be a living and holy sacrifice. The kind that God finds acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. What he means by that is this. In the Old Testament, they would bring a sacrifice into the temple before God. They would not bring a live sacrifice. They would slaughter a lamb. They would slaughter the sheep. They would slaughter the bull. They would slaughter the ox, whatever it was that they brought in for sacrifice. It was then a dead sacrifice burnt on the altar. Paul says, you know what? You don't do a whole lot of good to God if you're dead. So you bring your whole self as a living sacrifice. You just say, God, here I am. I'm going to live my life for you. In fact, we're going to talk about the practical side of reset. We're going to live reset. Last week was admitting. Today is about rethinking. Next week is about reliving. And so that's kind of where we're going on this whole thing. And Paul says, look, you bring your living self, just present it to God. Just say, here I am. You call the shots. I've been calling the shots. You call the shots. And there's a reason for this. And he'll get to it. Now, it seems like he's going to change directions in verse 2, but just hang on with me. He says, in light of everything that God has done for you, I want you to think about this. God has done a lot for you. He's done an awful lot for you. And when he gets to verse number 2, Paul starts to drill down now because he knows where your struggle is and where my struggle is. Verse number 2, he says, don't copy the behavior and the customs of this world. Now, that's a huge statement. I understand this because Paul knew where we lived. Even though he wasn't in Williston, North Dakota in 2014, nothing about culture, nothing about humanity has changed from then till now. Paul knows how easy it is for us to copy the customs of the world. So let me ask you this. Let's make it practical. Let's talk about money. I know, I said that we were going to be done talking about money for just a little bit. I'm taking pastoral liberties right now. Money. Let me just ask you about money. Do you think the way you handle money, would you say the way you handle money in your life, do you think it copies the biblical pattern, or do you think it copies more the pattern of the customs of the world? You know the answer to that question. Because Paul knew the customs of the world. He knew about Madison Avenue, he knew about TV advertising, he knew about print media, he knew about the culture, he knew all about the wants and the desires that we have, he knew about the struggles we'd have with money. So he says, look, I'm telling you, when it comes to money, don't copy the patterns about money. And he'll tell us why in just a little bit. What about marriage? Where have you gotten your cue about how to be married? Unfortunately, for a lot of us, man, we came out of broken homes, broken families. Dad wasn't around. Mom and dad divorced. Mom and dad were married 2-3 times. That kind of becomes maybe for us our pattern for marriage instead of a biblical pattern for marriage. Paul says, look, you can copy the customs of the world if you want to, but let me tell you what the outcome is going to be. You know what the outcome is going to be. Because you've watched it. You witnessed it. You saw it happen. Unfortunately, when it comes to relationships, do you take your relationships with the opposite gender? Do you get it from a biblical perspective, or did you learn it on a sitcom? Do you learn it in a magazine? Did you learn it in the locker room? Have you just learned it from society and culture, and you're just kind of on your own? Nobody has really taken the time to tell you what a healthy relationship is. Paul knew it would be so easy to copy the patterns of this world. What about entertainment? Do we have a biblical pattern of entertainment in our life? Or do we pattern our entertainment after the world's customs and patterns of entertainment? I know the answer to that question. Paul knew where the struggle would be for all of us. So he says, look, don't copy that. Because Paul knew where we would fight. He knew where the fight would happen. The battle happens in the mind. We start to think the wrong stuff in our mind, and it takes us to destinations we never wanted to go to, we never intended to go to. And Paul knew that sometimes we would get ourselves into a fix, we'd get into a difficult situation. Right now we're filing bankruptcy, we're on the second marriage, the second or the third, and the third marriage looks like the second and the first, and we're on this other relationship, and he's abusive, and I find this guy is just like the last guy, and she's like the last girl, and I'm still in this habit, and I can't break this habit, and I want to be free of this habit, and I'm in a money situation right now. Paul, look, he says, I know that you go through this stuff, and you'll always end up in the same destination if you think the same about those. You just copy the pattern of the world. Paul is going to tell us, ultimately God's going to tell us, I want you to be transformed. I want your life to look better than it is today. Pastor stands up here before you this morning saying, the reason I'm sharing this with you is so that you can get to where you want to be in life. So Paul says this in the rest of that verse. Look what he says, but this is like a hinge on a door. This is the direction you're going. This is the direction you're going. You can copy the patterns of the world, but I'm going to tell you a better way. He says, let God transform you. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Let him transform you into a new person. Let him hit the reset button in your life. Let him transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. The word transform is just this Greek word metamorphos, which is really like the caterpillar that turns into the butterfly. It's like saying you need to restore your mind. Something needs to change in you, because if you don't change the way you think, you're not going to change the way you live. It's just a reality. And so he says sometimes our minds need transformation. We need to do something about this. If you've ever restored furniture, I remember going to an auction sale with my grandparents when I was just a little boy, and I remember watching them as they bought this dresser at an auction sale in Hanks, North Dakota, on a cold fall rainy day. Reminisce with me, if you will. Loading that up in the back of a car, and I eventually inherited that old dresser, and when I'm 12 years old, I decided that I'm going to restore this thing. It was almost black. The finish on it was just so dark, and it was all marred up, and so I took upon the challenge. In 6th grade, I'm going to refinish this thing. Now, if you've ever refinished furniture before, this thing is almost black. I could say, you know what, I'm going to go get some, I think I'm going to make a light oak appearance on this dresser. Now, I could get that light oak stain, and I could just slather that stain on there really, really thick over that black finish. What's going to happen? Nothing. If you've ever restored a car, you can take that car with all its rust and all its chip paint, and you can say, I want this baby to be candy apple red. And you can take it in the paint booth, and you can spray that paint all over that thing if you want to, but it's done no good at all. You have to strip it right down to the metal. You've got to strip that furniture right down to the wood, because if you try to apply new stuff to the old stuff, nothing changes. And that's exactly what Paul says here. The reason things haven't changed in your life is you're trying to fix it with the wrong stuff. You're trying to use man-made programs. You're trying to go to this support group. You've read that book. You've gone to this program. You're watching this online. You got that DVD series, and nothing has changed because you haven't changed the way you think. And he says, look, if you change the way you think, God will transform you. It's just an incredible thing. And it's like God just says, all right, look, you start thinking different, and you're going to find out, I'm just going to hit this incredible reset button in your life, and it all changes. Because if you don't strip away the old, there'll never be an opportunity for anything new. And if we don't change the way we think about the past, what do you think is going to happen to our future? We will sabotage our own futures by thinking the same way in the future as we have in the past about everything in life. Now, how do we do this? This is where it gets really practical. This is the hard part, because remember we talked about the mind, like we can control so much, but how do we control the mind? Because even while I've been preaching, some of you have counted how many lights there are in the building, right? Some of you have counted ceiling tiles, you're counting the number of people that have blonde hair, whatever the case is, because it's hard to control your mind. Hard to control the mind, but you have done this. You have done this unknowingly. You have had control over your mind, because at some point in your life, you got fed up with the way it was, and you made the phone call, and you broke up with him, and a day or so after you broke up with him, you started feeling free, didn't you? It's like, free! You broke up with her, free, this is great. And then when you start to realize what life was like in that relationship, you said this, what was I thinking going out with him, her? At some point in your life, maybe the indebtedness got so bad, you decided, I got to take control over this. And you started doing some right stuff, and you started paying off the credit card debts, and you got a job and started being financially responsible. And the more responsible you became, you started looking back over that past, and you thought to yourself, what in the world was I thinking buying that boat? Okay? I know what I was thinking when I sold it. Oh, happy day, happy day. All right. At some point in our life, we look at the way we take care of our bodies, and we're just taking care of our body the way we've always taken care of our body. And at some point, we wake up in the morning and we say, I can't live like this anymore. Enough. And then we start to get healthy, and we're out running to the sidewalk from the front door. And I mean, just to have this great victory. And we look back on that, we say, what was I thinking? You see, you've already done some of this. You changed the way you thought about it. And things changed. But the incredible thing that we talked about last week is, we tend to learn lessons the fastest and the easiest about things that matter the least. We will learn really fast about how to play a game. We'll learn really fast about how to drive a car. We'll learn really fast about how to Twitter or Facebook. We'll learn really fast about those things, and they really don't have a lot of significance in life. But when it comes to the big things like marriage and money and health and some of those things, why is it that it takes us so long to learn those lessons? Maybe at some point in your life you did. You realized, what was I thinking? And when your thinking changed, your life changed. You changed your diet. You started giving. You started saving. You stopped smoking. You worked on the marriage. And your destination changed because your thinking changed. You see, you can pattern your thinking according to the culture around you. And it's so easy to do because culture makes it easy to pattern our thinking around culture. God says, look, if you want to change anything, you got to think differently. And that's why I'm telling you, read the Word of God. Nothing will transform you and change the way you think about yourself like the Word of God will, because the Word of God is truth. The culture around us is just an illusion. Okay, you can contend with me on that stuff if you want to, but I'm just telling you, I lived enough life to know the struggles I've had, and you've maybe had the same struggles. See, here's kind of how things can go. Let me put it to you in terms like this. You can be this guy right here, the gingerbread man, okay? You can be this guy right here. And when it comes to finances, you can just like this, like the pattern of the world. We'll just copy finances from the world. We'll copy relationship from the world. We'll copy marriage from the world. We'll copy the way we take care of ourselves from the world. We'll just go on to the world. We'll just copy. We'll just copy that. So we can be this guy right here. That's what Paul says. Don't do that, though. And I think when the Bible says don't, we shouldn't, right? Okay. So we can be this guy, or Paul says, instead of being that guy, we need to be this guy right here, okay? All right? If you don't know what this is, it's a transformer. I think it's a guy or something. And it transforms this. You can turn this baby into a dinosaur. I'm not going to embarrass myself and even try. I could give this to a young child in this church and like 6 seconds later, it's all done. Transform. That's what Paul says. You have a choice. You can be this, or you can be this. You can be this, or you can be this. That's what Paul says. And nothing will change in our life until we change the way we think about our life. Now, every thought, again, leads to a destination. The good ones and the bad ones. And when we get into the good destinations, we've all said this when we came to a good place. I'm so glad I made up my mind to break up with him. I'm so glad that I made up my mind to start eating right. I'm so glad that I made up my mind to change the way I entertain myself. I'm so glad I made up my mind, and you fill in the blank for you, to break the habit. I'm so glad that I made up my mind. It all begins with a thought. This isn't rocket science. This is pretty basic stuff, but it's difficult because it takes a great deal of discipline on our parts to do this. That's why it's hard. Wouldn't it be great if somebody else would do it for us? And unfortunately, sometimes it happens that we get ourselves into such a mess that our circumstances then dictate, I need to make a decision about my health. When you're laying flat on your back in a hospital room and you got tubes connected to you and monitors and they're poking needles all over the place, that's not the time to start thinking about a diet and an exercise plan. Wouldn't it be better to be a little bit proactive? When you are in the judge's chambers, you're standing before the judge in a court of law, that's not the time to think, I think we should start working on our marriage. Okay? When you're in bankruptcy court, you're trying to just get everything together and have enough food to put on your table and take care of your families, that's not the time to say, I think now would be a good time to start a financial planning seminar. That's why Paul says, now is the time to start thinking differently about these things. The question is that we all have to answer is, how long will we let the stuff in our lives go on before we reset our lives by resetting our thinking? And when we do, there's a payoff. When we do, there's a payoff. Because look what Paul says. Then, when you reset yourself in your thinking, then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. In other words, it's like Paul is saying, when you start thinking correctly, you start seeing correctly. When you start thinking correctly about yourself and about finances, marriage, and relationship, and school, and the boss, and your wife, and the cat, and the dog, suddenly you start looking at life completely differently. Probably one of the greatest questions I'm posed with as a pastor is, I want to know what God's will is for my life. And Paul says here, look, you want to know the will of God? Just lay yourself out completely before Him. Stop patterning your life after the world around you and start rethinking about how you live your life. And suddenly you're going to see with a different perspective that you've never seen before. When you change your thinking, you change your perspective on life. So, in essence, this is what Paul is saying. Just to summarize it for you, and I'll put the last slide up here for you. Change the way you think and you change the way you live. Change the way you think and you change the way you live. Just think about this for a little bit. Just think about this for a moment. Think about how you take care of yourself physically. I know you don't want to, but would you just imagine with me for just a little bit here about how you take care of yourself physically? Imagine how you would feel if suddenly, instead of looking at food as being comfort when you're lonesome, as being just something that your body needs to keep you alive. wonder if that'd make a difference in how you lived your life. What if you started thinking differently about relationships? That the reason you have settled for what you've settled for, the reason you're in the relationship with him or her, or you got yourself in that whole situation right now is, let's just be honest, you're lonely. There's a void, there's a gap in your life. You're thinking the only thing that I can use to fill that gap or that void to make me feel less lonely is that person. But you're not really satisfied with that person. You know that person's not the right one. But your thinking in your mind is, you know what, I'll never be able to marry the best woman or the best man for my life because I'm not worthy of the best. What if you started thinking about your marriage a little bit different? Instead of calling her the old lady, instead of calling him the old man. I don't want to be married to an old lady. Any of you men want to be married to the old lady? No. Any of you ladies want to be married to the old man? No. What if we started thinking about this is the woman that I chose to spend the rest of my life with. She is my friend. She is my partner. I will do anything for her. This is the man that chose to cover me. God has placed him in my life as a covering. I want to surrender and submit to his covering because I love him, and I will do whatever I can to support him, knowing that we are a union and a unit that work together. What if we started thinking differently about money? That you know what, money wasn't all made for me. That money is a tool in the hands of God to win souls to Christ because the next life is a lot longer than this life. What if we started thinking differently about the habits that we're in? That the habit you're in right now, you want to break that habit. And I could list some habits for you, but then you'd start thinking I'm picking on certain ones and some are worse than others, but you know what your habit is. What if I said, you know what, this habit isn't meant to fill that void in your life. You know what's meant to fill that void in your life? Jesus Christ, because he loves you so much. And he's waiting right here with his finger over the reset button. He's ready to hit the reset, and he's just ready to hit the reset button. Reset. He wants to reset your life right now. But the initiative begins with you. Are you willing to come and just offer your body to him, your life to him? Say, God, here I am. I'm going to make every effort to change the way I think about myself, about my marriage, about life in general, about whatever it is you're dealing with. And God says, so good to see you here. And he hits the reset button. Think how differently life could look like or feel like for you if you started just thinking differently about how you live your life. And next week, we're going to talk more about the practicality of living our life and why we should do what we're supposed to do.